The war in Europe in World War II was fought by an alliance of two countries attacked by Adolf Hitler, Great Britain and Russia, the Soviet Union. Neither country could have survived the war without the other. Great Britain and the Soviet Union were eventually joined by a third ally who played the decisive role in winning the war, the United States of America. Those three allies had very different governments and very different people leading those governments. The Soviet Union's dictator, Joseph Stalin, never trusted his English-speaking allies. He always worried that one of his allies would try to negotiate an individual peace agreement with Hitler. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill feared the same possibility with Stalin, but the alliance held all the way to the end of the war, with the president and the prime minister repeatedly promising Stalin that they would not engage in separate peace negotiations with the mass-murdering dictator Adolf Hitler, who invaded the Soviet Union. We now know how different that would have been if the United States had a president like Donald Trump during World War II. Donald Trump broke with the United States allies fighting Russian dictator Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine by sending a delegation led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio to a meeting in Saudi Arabia to negotiate with the murderous dictator Vladimir Putin's representatives. Here's the way Senator Marco Rubio saw Vladimir Putin before becoming Donald Trump's Secretary of State.
A gangster in Russia is threatening NATO, threatening the unity of Europe, and now expanding his reach into the Middle East at our expense.
That is the way Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt talked about Adolf Hitler's march across Europe, invading every country along the way, the countries that are now unified against Vladimir Putin's Hitler-style invasion of Ukraine. Here's what Secretary Rubio said today about his meeting with the people who work for what he used to call a gangster in Russia.
I came away today convinced that they are willing to begin to engage in a serious process to determine how and how quickly and through what mechanism can an end be brought to this war. Whether we can ultimately reach that outcome will obviously depend on every side in this conflict's willingness to agree to certain things.
Joining us now is Timothy Snyder, professor of history at Yale University. He's author of the New York Times bestsellers On Freedom and On Tyranny. Professor Snyder, I just want to add one more thing that was said on this same day that Secretary Rubio said that, just to show us how Donald Trump has stacked the deck now against Ukraine, who he apparently blames for the war. Let's listen to what Donald Trump said today about Ukraine.
I think I have the power to end this war, and I think it's going very well. But today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal.
You should have never started it. He's saying that to Ukraine.
Yeah, it's ghastly. Ukraine was invaded by Russia in violation of every fundamental principle of international law. And the Ukrainians have resisted far better and far longer than anyone would have expected or had a right to expect of them. And by resisting, they've allowed the rest of us throughout the West, throughout the world, to have a chance to engage in more or less normal politics for the last 3 years. They've held off darkness for so many other people. So the contemptuous way that Trump is treating them is not only wrong, it's morally disgusting.
And you point out there's a difference between negotiating and talking. What do you see actually happening in Saudi Arabia?
The crucial thing here, as you suggested earlier, is that the Ukrainians are not actually present. It's a little bit like it's 1941 and the United States meets with Nazi Germany to decide the fate of Great Britain without inviting the British. That's where we are right now. we are meeting with the aggressor. We are meeting with the representative of a man who was indicted for war crimes, and quite rightly so. We are legitimating this war of aggression by meeting with the representatives of the aggressor state. And we are marginalizing the people, the nation, the Ukrainian state that were attacked. Negotiation could take place between Ukraine and Russia about peace. It can't take place between the United States and Russia about peace because the United States and Russia are not at war. If the United States wished to bring an end to this war, and if Mr. Trump is right that he has the power to end this war, the way that that would look would be that the United States would make it harder for the aggressor to fight and easier for the state that's defending itself, Ukraine, to do so. But that is not what we are doing. If anything, we are throwing our power on the side of the aggressor, which is not going to bring peace. It's more likely to bring a longer and a bloodier war.
How does what we're seeing now compare to, say, what Henry Kissinger did in the Nixon administration that got the phrase shuttle diplomacy? Kissinger would talk to one side in the Middle East exclusively, and then Kissinger would go and talk to another side in the Middle East. And in the hope that that could come together into something. It never did come together into something lasting in the Middle East. But there was that was a version of talking to one side at a time.
Yeah, I mean, there's no coherence to what the United States is doing formally. We've got a special envoy to Ukraine. We've got a special envoy to Russia. The special envoy to Ukraine wasn't at the talks in Saudi Arabia, just as the Ukrainians weren't at the talks in Saudi Arabia. The Americans speak publicly about what they're doing in ways that are totally contradictory, with some American officials saying that we'll strengthen Ukraine, all the way to Donald Trump saying Ukraine might not even exist at the end of this. So there's no coherence to this except the underlying formal problem that we've left the Ukrainians out of it entirely. And the other thing which has happened, which is the United States has started to make demands on Ukraine. The other thing that Trump talked about today was that Ukraine should have presidential elections, which is a Russian talking point. The Russians are demanding that they have a say in how Ukraine is run, and the Americans are now echoing that. And at the Munich Security Conference, where I was a few days ago, the Americans demanded that Ukraine hand over half of its mineral wealth, half of its economic income, essentially, forever, in exchange for nothing in particular. So it's looking awfully like what we're doing is that we are using the threat of Russian violence to try to get things ourselves. That is a far cry from attempting to be a mediator in an ongoing conflict.
What should happen next?
What should happen next is pretty simple. I mean, in an ideal world where the U.S. were making sensible policy, what we would say is the United States should assist Ukraine. We should go up from the measly figure of 0.15% of GDP. We should help them more. And we should enforce sanctions on Russia and make it harder for Russia to prosecute this war. Trump was right about one thing. The United States does have the power to end this war, but it would have to make positive policy in a sensible direction. If you want a war to end, you have to make it harder for the aggressor and easier for the defender, not the other way around. In the world that we're actually in, where it doesn't look like American policy will be sensible, this has to be the hour of Europe. The Europeans have to make sure that Ukraine can defend itself, and they have to offer all the economic aid that they possibly can, beginning right now.
Donald Trump has never been able to mount an argument about anything without lying. And one of the interesting lies he tells about this war is he wildly exaggerates the number of casualties on both sides, puts it up into the millions, which isn't even close. And that is seemingly, if you can translate it into something that could have intention, to make himself seem even more heroic by stopping these millions of deaths, which are not occurring.
He's trying to make it seem like he's the one with any power. You know, a week ago, I was 20 miles away from the front in a city called Zaporizhzhia. And as you drive along the main boulevard, you see buildings that have newer bricks and older bricks. And the reason for that is that the Ukrainians repair the buildings. As soon as the Russians destroy something, a road, a building, a hospital, they repair it. I was there to open a school, which was built in 6 months, which is an extraordinary thing under rocket fire and bombing. The entire school was underground, and students were there very happy they could be in school. Ukraine is attacked. Things are destroyed, people are killed, and they keep fighting, they keep rebuilding. They have been doing this essentially on their own for a long time. Their country is not the wreck that Donald Trump is describing. Their trains run on time. Their roads are clear. Their cities function right up to the front. He's trying to create this idea that the Ukrainians are hopeless and Zelenskyy hasn't done anything, which is exactly wrong. They've been valiant, and we ought to be respectful and appreciative, and we ought to be on their side.